Hi, and welcome to this episode of Concise Conversations. Today we're going to be speaking to Tom Furst about innovation, and it's a real honour and privilege to be speaking to someone like Tom, because for over 2 decades he was an executive lead at one of the most innovative organisations ever to have existed, SRI International. That's the Stamford Research Institute. We talked to Tom about how when he took over it had lost its way a little bit and he managed to bring it back to his former glory. We talked to him about some of the innovative projects that he oversaw, such as the development of Siri. We also talked to Tom about methodologies and practices that you can use in your organisation and your everyday life to bring the power of innovation to you. And finally, we get to know Tom just a little bit better with the Concise Conversations first 8 questions. Enjoy. Hi Tom, thanks for joining us on today's episode of Concise Conversations.
Hi Bob, delighted. Glad we could do this.
It's a great honour to be able to speak to you about innovation today, because you were the CFO for a long time of one of the most innovative organisations I think ever to have existed, SRI, the Stamford Research Institute. I think if we could start off just by talking a little bit about what that is for those people that don't really know about it.
Sure. What is now SRI International was started in the late 1940s by Stanford University and people who were associated with it. And it was called Stamford Research Institute. And the trustees of the university were the trustees of Stamford Research Institute. And it was started with a number of goals. One of them was to help in the development of the western part of the United States, which at the time really wasn't all that developed. Shortly after World War II had ended. And
it's hard to imagine that these days, but...
Right. So it was a good place for to hire consultants, for professors who could do their research and their consulting in a way that wasn't integrated with the lab and department structure at the university. And it grew and it prospered. Became, I think, close to 2,000 people by the 1970s. And then it became, when the whole Vietnam War protest thing erupted in the States, it became an awkward possession. It was doing a fair amount of government contracting, and the university decided that it was just time to separate itself from Stanford Research Institute. So there was something called the separation agreement, and over a period of a couple of years, SRI, Stanford Research Institute, became SRI International. They were actually given a couple of years to change their name, and Stanford Research Institute became SRI. It's the genesis of that. They continued as a not-for-profit, tax-exempt organization with their own board of directors. And they had a charter purpose to create a public benefit through the application of science and technology. And, and that's just been their guiding light across the decades. They continued to operate. They continued to thrive. Like any organization, they went through some down periods financially. It was interesting because they were sort of counter-cyclical with the Valley. The Valley was very much a commercial beast, responding to different aspects of the cycle. And what was Stanford Research Institute, later SRI, was largely a government contractor. They got most of their funding from the U.S. federal government. And that would often run in different cycles. So there would be times when SRI was up and hiring and growing, and the Valley was kind of flat. And other times the exact opposite was true. So it was an interesting, unique presence in Silicon Valley at that point. So that's SRI. It continues to exist today. It's been around for, I guess, 75, going on 80 years at this point in time.
Yeah, I was just looking at some of the, in terms of innovation, like it's very wide. It's some of the notable things it's been involved in. It was like, I was quite excited to see that it was helped with the creation of Disneyland. It also helped with sort of identifying air pollution and the problems with ozone, check processing, speech recognition, computer mouse. I like to see that they also tried to work out about psychic phenomenon in the 70s, but unfortunately that didn't get anywhere. Software infrastructure, astronomy, and we'll talk a little bit later about Siri as well. So if you're talking about innovation, it's like way to go in terms of let's spread ourselves wide and still deliver. So I mean, that's just an exciting institution to be part of. So the next thing I'd just like to ask you is like, How did you then get involved with SRI? What led you to it?
Yeah, so I'm an East Coast guy. I was born in New York City and grew up out on Long Island, and went away to undergraduate school at Villanova University, which is outside of Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And after I graduated, I took a job with RCA in their corporate finance office. Their CFO at 30 Rock, Rockefeller Plaza, had initiated this internship for a small group of people every year. And they'd bring 10 or 15 in, and they'd rotate them around the corporation at different facilities for different business-related activities. And at the end of that year, you'd pick a permanent location. And I went through that internship and ended up at a defense division down in Moorestown, New Jersey, southern New Jersey.
Okay.
And I only spent a couple of years there working on inventory management. And they had just finished building the ballistic missile early warning system. And inventory was a fascinating problem. Those sites where they look for the incoming missiles are located in places like Greenland and Alaska. And when you're responsible for inventory, we had bulldozers slide off the ice pack and ship sink on the way to site. So inventory became a fascinating.
You don't want to be the guy that lost a nuclear bomb, do you?
So I stayed at RCA for about 3 years. And of course, RCA is now owned by General Electric, who purchased them in the mid-1980s. I then went to a little think tank up in State College, Pennsylvania, near where Penn State University is. And I took a job there in budgeting and finance, and eventually got into contracts and operating management. I ran a business unit for them for a while. And they were a small subsidiary of the Singer Company, the old Singer sewing machine company.
Yeah.
Their name was HRB Singer. I spent 9 years there, and my wife and I started our family up there, and it's a delightful little college town up in the mountains. And they are now owned by Raytheon. So they went through a series of restructurings. I left there and I went down to the Washington Beltway, and I worked for a place called PRC, Planning Research Corporation. It's a professional technical services company. All these companies I worked for prior to coming to SRI had two or three common characteristics. One of them is they were government contractors. Two is they were high-tech professional services. And I worked across about every piece of the infrastructure that surrounds them, with a focus on finance. So I left State College and I went down to PRC, and I spent 14 years there, and I got into the role of chief financial officer, first at the division level, then at the group, and then the sector level, and I worked my way up the organization. PRC was eventually put into play, and the U.S. defense business was downsizing and restructuring heavily during the 1980s, and PRC got caught up in that, and they eventually were acquired by an organization called Emhart, which was acquired by Black & Decker, which sold this little government contracting piece to Northrop Grumman. So more restructuring. At that point, I went back to school, and I got my MBA at William & Mary, and I was working for Booz Allen and Hamilton. I did a little consulting when I was working on my MBA, and Booz Allen was one of my consulting customers, and they decided to hire me. So I went to work for them as the senior financial executive for the half of Booz Allen that is a government contractor. Half of Booz was the commercial consulting that competed with McKinsey and Bain and BCG, and the other half was this thing they called the Tech Center, which was basically a large group.
Yeah, because that's more what I knew them as, is the McKinsey style thing, and didn't realise there was such a big sort of government contract side to it as well.
Yeah, it was very big. It was when I was there, it was probably about 4,000 people, maybe $500 million a year in revenue. So it was pretty good size. And I stayed there for 4 or 5 years. And someone who had been the COO of Booz, who actually started that piece of Booz in the mid-1970s in retirement, took the job as CEO of SRI. And we overlapped a bit. We knew of each other. He was the one who sent the headhunters after me. And, my wife and I were sitting in Leesburg, Virginia, and, the good news is we were comfortable, and the bad news is we were comfortable, and our nest was empty. And when this opportunity to move to California came along, we we, at a personal point of view, we said, we hadn't seen that part of the country yet. And, professionally, SRI was in a little financial trouble. And my career goal had been to be the CFO of a major internationally known organization. And this just seemed to be the right moment to make that move. So we did it. We were going to do it for maybe 5 years. That was a quarter of a century ago. So, we were happy and comfortable out here, and it was an amazing career move for me. So, so we did that in 1996. And of course, in 1996, the Valley was just taking off. It was the internet which had been created in the late 1960s, was kind of the purview of scientists and academics for a really long time. But the World Wide Web kind of came along in the early 90s, 92, 93. There were maybe a couple of hundred websites out there, and half of them were unstable. But by 95, 96, there were a couple of million websites out there. And they were just changing the world. They were allowing complete revisions of business models across every industry. So my move to the Valley was timed for that.
A super exciting time to land there and in that position where everybody wants to work with you, everybody wants to discuss things with you, cooperate with you. So it sounds like a really exciting move. So can you tell me, you said that SRI at that point, throughout its history, it's had peaks and troughs, and you said that it was in a little bit of distress when you arrived there. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and then what you did to try and change it and reshape it?
Yeah, I think that a lot of organizations, the success that they enjoy is a function of their leadership, and over a 70-year period of time, I guess it was 60 when I joined them. They had been through a number of iterations of leadership, and who had different strategies and different plans. Some were more successful than others. There were some great early year stories when SRI did incredibly well. The Bank of America thing you mentioned, for example, after World War II, all the GIs came home and they were starting families and entering the workforce. And in the late 40s, the economy was booming, and there was no way to pay for anything in those days except cash and a check. And the number of checks just totally overwhelmed the Federal Reserve System. So SRI was able to figure out for the Bank of America, under an agreement, how to basically streamline the process of getting checks through the system. And they did it by taking about half of the data that had to be key punched in and just pre-printing it on the bottom of the check in the form of those little black characters. So it just overnight doubled the speed with which the Federal Reserve could process checks. And they moved from one of those to the next. In the late 60s, they had the internet. The ARPANET, as it was initially known, was the first 4 nodes were Stamford Research Institute, UCLA, University of Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. So they were involved just that early. Doug Engelbart came up with the computer mouse and hypertext and graphical user interface, and demoed that in 1969. I think if you go online and you do a search on the mother of all demos, it will take you to a recording of Doug Engelbart showing people what hypertext was and how you could use a computer. So it went through those periods, and there were times. Sometimes it was because the federal government spending was just off. They go through cycles, and a lot of people whose business is tied to federal contracting go through those peaks and valleys too. So when I was being recruited in the late to mid 1990s, they were kind of on a down cycle. They had been shrinking and losing staff. A lot of the technical magic was still there, but they had kind of lost a bit of the mojo from a business point of view. And one of the reasons I was brought in was to kind of get them back on the tracks. And that was pretty straightforward in the basic block and tackle business management stuff. And you set plans and milestones, and you measure how you do, and you get management motivated and focused on the things they need to be focused on. The other thing they needed to do was to kind of get their confidence back up. And just after I was brought in, they brought in a new CEO who brought with him a set of skills related to commercialization and value creation and innovation. His name was Kurt Carlson. And he had come from a subsidiary of SRI called the Sarnoff Corporation. When GE had bought RCA in the mid-1980s, GE donated the RCA corporate research labs in Princeton, New Jersey to SRI. So SRI, this is before my involvement with them, but they came to operate it as a wholly owned subsidiary, and they had a lot of the skills that SRI eventually came to use to create a lot of those spin-offs that you were talking about, Nuance, Intuitive Surgical, etc. So we got the organization financially turned around and back on its feet in the late 1990s and around the year 2000, and that's sort of when the latest round of commercialization successes took off. Things like Nuance and Intuitive Surgical did their IPOs in 2000, and Siri came not that long after it.
So I've seen that you believe a lot in like creating dashboards and dashboarding. I just wondered like how you manage to create a dashboard that can give you information about like innovation and how innovation is succeeding or not succeeding.
So I'm going to answer that question. Yes, it's true. And as a chief financial officer, I believe in what gets measured gets done. And one of the questions people ask me sometimes is what's the best way to do innovation? Should you do innovation bottom up or should you do innovation top down? Now, if you're in a startup, there's no distinction. You're only working on one product. But if you're in a big organization and you're trying to have multiple commercialization and multiple anything going on, you really need an organized way of tracking it. Bottoms up innovation, from my vantage point, tends to be orderly in terms of products, markets, and customers. They're closer to them, but it also tends to be chaotic. Top-down innovation tends to be relatively dumb in terms of products, markets, and clients because they're often removed. But they also tend to be orderly. They tend to be capable of prioritization and things like measurement and tracking and weeding out, deciding to launch certain things and stop other things. So you sort of need a combination. Figuring out the balance between those two is where it's always been the sweet spot in my mind. So when we figuring out how to do commercialization in a way that was repeatable and had a good success record. If you talk to a venture capitalist at a large VC organization, they'll talk to you about their portfolio, and they'll talk to you about the fact that most startup initiatives don't make it, and for every home run they have, they've got a couple of singles, maybe a double here and there, and a bunch of strikeouts. So the game is to get if you're a large organization attempting to do multiple commercialization activities at the same time, the question is, how do you keep your batting average up? And if you look at all the things that you need to do, you need the right talent, you need the right business plan, you need the right facilities and equipment and enough capital, and you need a rigor. I mean, most startups, most commercialization initiatives are projects. And, projects need schedules and they need rigor and they need to be reviewed. One of the biggest reasons things don't make it, startups don't make it in this valley, is because of a failure to execute against what's often a reasonable business plan. So we tried to bring that type of rigor to the process. Most of SRI was kind of a researchy, academically oriented group of scientists working in laboratories, getting the science and the intellectual property developed, and that's a different business model than running a startup, which needs to be driven hard against milestones and proof points. So a lot of the answer to your question is we really needed to run simultaneously two different business models, which had different kinds of management constructs and different cultures to some degree, and make them work not just side by side, but collaboratively. And that's where I spent a lot of my time.
Cool. Did so? I saw that SRI developed a methodology called the NABC methodology. Could you talk us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. This term innovation gets thrown around a lot, and everyone doesn't mean the same thing when they say it. From our point of view at SRI, innovation isn't just being clever, and it's not just being inventive. It can include those things, but to us, innovation meant creating sustainable value for a customer, and that's the way we defined it. So to do that consistently, we developed a process, and NABC is part of that process. What NAB stands for is, first of all, need. You've got to identify a big need. I mean, the world is full of problems. Most of those are interesting problems, right? But there are some important problems. So if you want to be innovative, first thing you need to do is find a really important problem. In my in-basket, I'd have 50 things. Most of those are interesting, but there's a couple of them that are really important. If you want to be innovative in the eyes of your boss, find out the 2 or 3 things that he or she is losing sleep over, and then help them put together a solution for it. So N is need. You've got to find a need. There's a lot of people in the Valley who, let me back up. I went to a meeting of chief marketing officers once, and one of the speakers got up and said, half of the startups in the Valley are created by technologists who come up with something that's really neat, and they build a startup around it, and then they go out and they hire marketing people to find something useful to do with it, right? And ones that start that way, I'll never say never, but in general, they don't do anywhere as well as the cases where somebody spots a really big burning need, and they go off and they put together a solution for that need. So the innovation is sort of a sequencing in the way you think about things. If you think about the world just in terms of technology, you're not going to get there as often as if you think about the world as needs and problems to be solved, and then the powerful solutions for that. So N is need. A, which is the next letter, is approach. What is your really powerful, compelling solution for that need? B is benefits. Value propositions are just saying, this is the benefit I want to deliver to somebody. What are the quantitative and qualitative value propositions that say it's really worthwhile doing that? People love to gravitate to the qualitative. It's neat, it's elegant, it's fun to use, it's whatever. And qualitative is fine because a lot of this is emotional appeal in many businesses. But there's also a quantitative part of it, right? If it's going to cost you a certain amount of money to make something happen, and how does that compare to the amount of money it takes to create that outcome? So, is it faster? Is it better? Is it more precise? Is it, if you're going to put GPS into something, is there a quantitative benefit to what you're going to have once you do that justifies the added cost and complexity of the product that does it? So N is the need, A is the approach, B is the benefits, quantitative and qualitatively, and then C is competition. It's rare that you are the sole approach to solving a problem. And you need to be realistic and bright-eyed and wide-eyed about how you stack up against an alternative. And one of the rigors we used to press is a competitive analysis. When you're in the middle of a startup, you get mesmerized by your approach. And a lot of people don't take the time to stop, raise their head, and look around and see what else is out there working on the same problem. And that if you find something else, it doesn't mean necessarily that you stop, but maybe it means that you have a course correction or an adjustment in what you're attempting to do. So anyway, NABC, to answer your question directly, is a process that we use, and we marinated the entire organization in this NABC process. So everybody talked the same language. When someone said, you need a value proposition, if you're going to bring that in looking for funding, everyone knew what we were looking for and the type of standards we expected in the pitch that we got.
That's great. Sounds so. It's interesting to see that approach, has been used to create such a wide variety of products and services and spin-offs. The same sort of things that developed the check processing, which I think is amazing. Like you said earlier, the real solution was just to print half of the information at the bottom. Sometimes that's what innovation should be, just a simple solution. And then also that same process led to hyper sophisticated things like the computer mouse and Siri. So yeah, it's great to see that there is an approach that can lead to consistent innovation that works. One question that I find interesting is, how were all these academic people, how did they decide what they did? Were they just sat around kind of like coming up with their own interesting ideas and concepts, and then you just let them get on with it, and then every so often they'd come to you and go, oh, I've got this cool thing? How did that work?
So that's a really great question, and it was an important one in SRI's life. So the nature of academic progress, technical progress, moving the state of the art, is significantly what you described. Academics, research scientists will try to answer a set of technical questions, and when they're successful, then they will look to see what the next set of questions are, challenges, and they will move the state of the art forward. That's, it's a little bit more precise than that depending on what discipline you're in, but it is driven that way. It is driven by moving the state of the art of the science forward. And it is on a certain tempo. There's certain things about that you can't make go faster. You can improve it with funding and resources to some extent, but there are often limiting factors. When you switch that over into value creation, you need to make a couple of changes. One of them is the one that we talked about earlier, which is that you need to think about the world in terms of needs combined with problems and approaches. So what we attempted to do is to work through the different layers of the organization. We had laboratories, probably 40 or 50 of them, depending on when you took count, that were organized into divisions, that were organized into one SRI. And the best ideas were always bubbling up at the laboratory level. And to some degree, some of them were just neat new ideas that would help a customer or a group of customers, but they were never going to be innovations in the sense of a startup or a broad-based licensing deal. So to some extent, you need to let some of that bubble, but you need to have resources and a decision-making process in place so that the best ideas from a commercialization point of view could get the resources and were encouraged to bring those ideas forward. So we had forums that existed at the lab division and corporate level where people who thought they had good ideas would bring them in. They were coached about how to present them in an NABC framework, and they were helped to iterate them. Sometimes if it was somebody who had great technical skills but without marketing skills, we would partner them together with a business development person. So we would, and the best ideas at the lab level would bubble up to the division level, where there would be more money, more resources, and it would be a natural selection process that was both nurturing but also winnowing. So it was helping the best, but it was also down selecting, and it was, telling most of them really no. Either it wasn't a commercialization candidate for whatever reason, or maybe in a couple of years it would be, keep working on it, or we've already missed that market. 3D printers are already a done thing. Let's move on to something else. So we made it this natural selection process where we helped and supported the best ideas to come forward. We also found ways of making incentive systems. If you were in a startup, you'd get equity, of course, as part of your package. In a not-for-profit, equity really isn't a big part of the compensation there, and it was one of the reasons why it was difficult for SRI to compete with the Valley for talent. But we found a way, fairly under the IRS rules, of sharing some of the upside that SRI would get in the form of royalties or equities if this idea that they brought forward was successful. So we kind of got the entire organization, human resources, marketing, technology together, all working on this one process of getting the best ideas bubbled up to the top, getting the discipline of the NABC in terms of how we all communicated with each other. And then that was actually a big part of the secret sauce.
So, yeah, it sounds really an exciting thing to be part of. You're allowed to go off and push the fringes of knowledge, and then you can then bubble up, and you can see it grow. It's a really exciting and interesting proposition, because it is sort of like a mini startup ecosystem in its own right, but you've also got access to resources that you might not have if you were just trying to scrap at in the valley sort of thing. So is that how you, in terms of recruitment, how did you go out and find people, and how, what were you looking for, and how did you think someone was a good fit for SRI?
Yeah, it's another great question. For example, in the mid-1990s, you couldn't find a programmer. So, they were, Apple and Google and Cisco and all these people were just snapping up everyone for wonderful comp packages. So if you look at the motivational makeup of the workforce, there are people on one extreme who have one goal, and that is to make $5 or $10 million in the next year, right?
Yeah.
If you go to the other extreme, there are people whose sole motivation is to have an impact, and they love the science. And if I weren't direct depositing their paycheck, they probably wouldn't even make the time to cash them. So there was a part of that spectrum of motivational makeup that SRI would never be able to appeal to because of what they were and what they did and what they couldn't provide. But there's a significant percentage of that population that is motivated by having an impact. And all the studies we did of our population, our best scientists at SRI, clearly identified time after time that having a big impact was what was most important to them. And by the way, I think if you go to Stanford and Harvard and MIT and all the great centers of scientific knowledge that are not embedded in a for-profit corporation, and you ask the question, having an impact is going to be one of the biggest motivators you find. So that was one of the ways that we were able to do it. The second way that we were able to do it is collaboration. If collaborating inside of a university structure has gotten a little bit better, but I've often heard the analogy that university professors are sort of like sailboats, a group of them being out in a body of water, that if they're within sight of each other, they're by definition racing. So trying to get some of the best innovations, most powerful ones, happen at the intersection of the disciplines. So I think you mentioned robotic surgery, intuitive surgery. That was a marriage of mechanical engineering and robotics and software and life sciences. So very few organizations can bring that breadth of discipline together in one organization where the management and reward systems and the accountability all support making them work together. So we could do that, which was unique. And we compared well to universities, but we also compared well to startups. If you're in a startup, you're probably doing one or two things, and you need to do that extremely well. And you're going to be doing those one or two things for a long time until that startup succeeds. And for some people, that's okay. But for other people, they really like the diversity. They like the fact that they can collaborate with people in other disciplines. When we worked on a device that helps reduce the infection rate when you have to implant a catheter in somebody on a long-term basis. And, there was a state of the art at the time that said that you use chemicals and drugs and you coat the implant with certain things. But there were other sciences that said that if you put a low-grade electrical field in that same implant, or if you equip it to give off a small amount of ultraviolet light, low-grade electricity and UV light are very good at suppressing bacteria and infection. So we set off down that path, but we hit a point in time where we really needed to get a clinical partner involved in that. And we were able to go to Stanford Medical School and have a couple of surgeons who worked with kids on implants, who thought this was a really important problem in what they did. And it was easier for us to build those type of collaborative partnerships, both within the organization and external to the organization, because we were a not-for-profit and because we had that willingness to look broadly for solutions outside of what we were.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the startup world. It's hard to get someone on the phone, but I guess with SRI's heritage, you can get a lot more people on the phone, and they'll listen to you. Whereas with the startup, you're like, "Hi, yeah," and you don't get any response. I'd just like to talk a little bit about one of the biggest things that SRI created, and that's Siri. So how does something like that start? Someone just came into you, knocked on the office door and said, "Hey, I've got this idea for speech recognition, personal assistant. Let's go for it." How does it work?
So that's another fascinating story. It's a long story because a lot of the pieces that came together to form Siri were actually started years earlier. Open agent architecture, speech recognition. The artificial intelligence that goes into interpreting somebody's intent, inference engines, that sort of thing. And they were all sitting around slowly coalescing well before they became Siri. So, it's rare that something that profound just happens. Okay, it usually is a convergence of things that have been out there for a while. Specifically with Siri, that actually began with a U.S. federal government initiative, DARPA, the same organization that created the ARPANET in the late 1960s, the organization that kept changing its name back and forth between ARPA and DARPA. But in around the year 2000, DARPA's leadership believed that if they could equip soldiers with a tool, a productivity tool that would automate a lot of the things that just soldiers and military units needed to do, if they could take that off the table or make it much more efficient to get them done, that military unit would outperform military units that didn't have that tool. So their belief in that was, and the fact that they eventually funded a 5-year, $200 million development project to create a military version of what became Siri, is the reason why that happened. And, I just, to segue back in time just a moment, if you look at a lot of the big innovations, be they the global positioning system, GPS, speech recognition software, the miniaturization of electronics, the ARPANET, so many of the things that have become huge in the U.S. economy began with that type of government-funded program. And in the case of Siri, that's what happened. So SRI put together a bid for that 5-year program. We had kind of the who's who of AI, and as subcontractors, we had Stanford and MIT and Berkeley and Carnegie Mellon and players of that ilk as subcontractors. And we put in a bid to create the government version of Siri. I think in our last conversation I used the term Radar O'Reilly on steroids. So if you think about the old MASH television show, and Radar O'Reilly was this magical administrative person who could make everything happen fast. And that was the goal. Some of it related to calendars and scheduling and all these things that can be automated if you put some effort into it. So we did that, and each year in that 5-year period, there was a final exam, and there were specific milestones and capabilities that this development effort needed to achieve. Think about them as annual final exams, and if you pass that final exam, then you got to do the next year. So it was, DARPA is a very rigorous organization. They spend a lot of money, but they're very good at making sure they get payback for it because of the rigor that they insist that you put into it. So we got about 3 years into that, and it was occurring to us that this thing is not only working, but there's some huge commercial applications for what we're coming out of that. And at the time, we were all working on flip phones. And if you remember the old flip phone with 12 little buttons, basically a telephone pad, and at some point they started to hook up data networks to the telephone service. And we were all sitting there with those 12 little buttons trying to navigate data networks, and it was insane, right? So we had that. Apple had just come out with the touchscreen for the iPhone, and that was a great step forward. But a lot of the initial applications, city guides and what's the weather, and they were fairly narrow applications. So what fit well with a commercial application of what we were doing for DARPA was to come up with a system that could look across those narrow domains and pose a question and pull pieces of the answer from different sources and integrate them together. I want to, I need a restaurant a reservation for 2 at a romantic restaurant for Saturday night at 8 o'clock. Well, you could go to 4 or 5 different apps. You could go to the City Guide. You could, you might be able to go to Open Table, or you could get pieces to the answer from different verticals. But we found a way to pull them together. We signed up partnerships with some of those verticals, and they became part of an ontology, an ecosystem that the Siri software could pulse and bring back answers, not links. So that's the way we did it. Initially, we tried to license what became Siri to the big telecom carriers. We thought this would be a very big value-added thing for them and their competition. But we could not get a deal done that had what we believed was the appropriate value for what we were bringing to the table. So we hit a point where we said, what's going to do this? Let's do this as a startup. And we went out and found a couple of venture partners who we had worked with over the decades, and we sold them. We interested them in this, and they stuck with it. We did a startup called Siri. We licensed our intellectual property into it. We hired a team. We got a seed round, then an A round, and then a B round. We created an app for the Apple Store, and 60 days after that app went out, had been released, Steve Jobs called the leadership team at Siri and invited them over to his house, and he said that he wanted to buy the company, and they said no. Our goal is not to make a lot of money. Our goal is to get this technology out there, because at that time there was no such thing as a virtual personal assistant. People didn't know what it could do for them, how it could transform either their business or their lives, and that was the motivation of the leadership team. So Jobs went away, and a month or 2 later he came back, and this time he had a full business plan to integrate Siri into the iPhone, and then a deal got done. So that's how it happened.
That's great. Just one thing that I've been asked a few times when I told people I was going to speak to someone who helped with the development of Siri, and that it came from SRI. Was it called Siri, just SRI with an I slotted in, or why was it called Siri?
I was pretty close to Siri when it was being created, and I personally know almost everybody who was on the board and the leadership team. And I will tell you, if you talk to 4 or 5 of those people, you're going to get 4 or 5 different answers.
Right.
The government project that preceded Siri was called CALO, C-A-L-O, and the genesis of that was cognitive assistant that learns and organizes. It was an acronym. The Latin term "calanus" literally translates to soldier's servant. So there were multiple answers for that question. SRI didn't want to put the name CALO into the startup,
Sure.
So the startup needed to come up with their own name. And SRI, with the I added to the end of it, is one of the explanations. There's also a Scandinavian word, which escapes me at the moment, that translates into something related to what Siri does, bring people together. So that the real answer to that's probably lost in lore. But it's as good an answer as any is SRI with an IF.
Brilliant. That's the one that I prefer. I'm going to keep believing that one. You've always been a big proponent, like we discussed earlier, in like clear and succinct communication, and you wrote an op-ed recently for the Philadelphia Inquirer where you had the fortune to see Martin Luther King speak in person. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What did it mean at the time? You said that you were impressed by his speaking. How did that influence you going forward?
Yeah, so there's actually two stories. One of them not related to the conversation we've been having, and one of them related. The one that isn't related is, back in 1965, I was president of the student body at Villanova, and we had a speaker program, and we were fortunate to get Dr. King to come to the campus and give a talk. And this was shortly after he had won the Nobel Peace Prize, which he got, I believe, in late 1964. And on January 20th, 1965, he came to our campus and spoke. And I had a chance to spend 30 or 40 minutes alone with he and the university president in quiet conversation while we waited for the field house to fill up. And then we went over, and it was my honor to introduce him to 4,000 or 5,000 people and to a regional television audience. And yeah, that was an amazing personal experience. And I've always been. He is such a terrific communicator on things that can be complicated, but also expressed so simply if you've got someone who knows how to express it. And as he spoke, I was actually sitting right behind him on stage, and I could see around him, and I could see these 4,000 or 5,000 faces just riveted on what he was saying and how he was saying it. And there were certainly a bunch of messages in that, and one of them is, speak up for things that are important and figure out how to say them in a way that really conveys your message to somebody. So, that was a significant personal experience. And the article in the Inquirer, it had been 58 years since an article and that same photo actually had appeared on page one above the fold in the Inquirer the next day, January 21st of 1965. So it just seemed to be maybe a good moment to revisit it and maybe talk about some messages that are relevant in today's world about people speaking up on topics that are important to them. Let me take that point, though, and relate it back to the startup thing, the innovation. Yeah. One of the hardest but incredibly necessary things to do when you're doing innovations and you're attempting to create startups or interest other people is the ability to articulate an idea really crisply. The term elevator pitch is used a lot, and there are a lot of moments where you don't get a lot of time. If you're giving a pitch to a venture capitalist, you might go in there with a 20-slide deck. If you don't get their attention and really grab it in the first 2 or 3 slides, you've lost them. And it's the same thing if you're writing government grants. These days, there's so much competition for National Science Foundation and NIH grants that a lot of the SRI scientists went after. If you may have a great 100-page package, but if you don't really nail it in the first couple of paragraphs, people aren't going to read it. It's going to be thrown out. There's just too many papers to read. So this notion that you need to grab, you've got to be able to distill down what it is about what you're doing that's really powerful and articulate that crisply. And then iterating it. The Siri startup bubbled up over a period of a couple of years. And the first presentation they did on what became Siri, well, it was mildly interesting, but, you wouldn't think about getting up from your table and filling your coffee cup again while they were in the middle of giving that pitch. And by the 35th or 40th time they had given that presentation, you're sitting on the edge of your seat and you're saying, wow, I can't not be involved in this. So another part of our process, and maybe relevant for the Dr. King example you bring up, you've got to find a way of bringing your ideas to life. It's got to be a great idea. It's got to have a powerful need, approach, value proposition, but you need to be able to convince people. If what you're doing is incremental to something that's already out there, you're not going to have a hard time convincing people. They're going to kind of get it. But in the case of Siri, there had been no such thing as a virtual personal assistant. So people didn't have a mental model. So we needed to bring a lot of people along with us, customers, staff members, investors, clients, in terms of what Siri could do for you to make it successful. So that iteration and bringing things to life were also key components of this value creation process, innovation at SRI.
Yeah, could you tell us the story about the robotic surgery and how that eventually got through? Because I thought that was an interesting example of that.
Yeah, that's another great story. The chief scientist behind that is a fellow named Phil Green, who was just a prolific inventor, innovator at SRI. He was one of the people responsible for the application of acoustic technology for medical uses, sonograms, that type of thing. And he also got off into robotic surgery. And he and others had become convinced that, the precision level in certain surgical procedures had become so refined, so small in scale, that new tools were needed. And Phil developed this concept of using robotics, which could downsize the movements of a human hand so that they were doing things that were much more precise. And he could get instruments inside of the body to work on that were much smaller form fit than a human hand with the typical instruments that were used. And for years, he wrote grant request after grant request, and they were just turned down. You can sort of picture this panel of conservative PhDs saying to him, "Dr. Green, let me understand what you're proposing. You're going to take the magic hands, the golden hands of the surgeon, out of the patient, and you're going to replace it with a robot." Right. Okay. So for years, Phil was turned down. And then one year, Phil put together a little video. And the video was a close-up of of a grape being neatly sliced by a scalpel. And after 10 seconds of that scene, the camera pulled back, and you could see that it was robotic hands holding both the grape and the scalpel. Phil got his grant. So, I mean, you've got to bring it to life because, I'm not a visual person. My wife is a very visual person. She can deal with little swatches of paint and picture this room that color and this room a subtly different color. You can paint a 3x5 foot, swatch for me before I get the idea. So there are some people who just need to have it brought to life, particularly if it's something unique and something different. And Phil did that. And by the way, we did that too on Siri. At the time, the Android was the competition to Siri. And we benchmarked, we did test groups, answer these 5 or 10 questions, find an airline reservation, find a hotel reservation, where's the nearest CVS. And we timed people and we looked at how long it took them to complete these tasks, how angry and frustrated they were when they finished, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that's a very important dimension to it. Just bringing it to life and understanding how your customers react to it.
I think, that's a really important point because you would think that someone who's developed a robotic surgeon wouldn't have too much trouble getting people to invest in it, but still, you've really got to get that idea across in a way that makes people believe. I'd like to ask you now, what are you doing now? What you see yourself doing in the short term, whether there's a way people can contact you, get in touch with you, find out what you're doing.
Sure. Well, I'm at the stage of my life where I don't need to work full time, which is kind of a good thing. I don't have
Nice.
the commuting and I can focus on grandkids and those and
Yeah.
traveling after COVID. Um, I'm, I think I hit the point that a lot of my friends have hit in life where you're interested in conveying what it is you think you've learned across your career and across your life to other people. I mean, one of the reasons why it's a joy for me to do this is that there are a lot of people who would benefit from understanding a
Yeah.
little bit more about innovation. Not that I have the only insight into what that is. I mean, if you can listen to other really knowledgeable people, but I think I have something to add to that conversation based on
Definitely.
my career, and I like to share that. And I do that in a number of ways. I've been involved in a couple of startups in different fields. I have been executive in residence at MIT for a year, which was
Cool.
a fun appointment. I've consulted to a range of different organizations, some of them for profit, some of them not for profit. I've written on the subject. I've done some articles. I've published an article in the National Association of Corporate Directors on creating an innovative organization. And I serve on boards. And I do some of these things pro bono, and I do some of them for a fee or a business arrangement. I have a website, tomfurst.net, and I
Cool. We'll
have,
put that in the
and you can find me
description.
on LinkedIn. So, yeah, and I've ended up working with such a range of people, some domestic, some international, that I never, some of them I'd never heard of before. I spent a delightful year or two working with an Australian version of the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, NASA, all sort of rolled into one. It's
Right.
called CSIRO, and it's a fascinating organization, making a huge difference. But I will say that not-for-profits, whether they're U.S.-based research institutes like SRI, whether they're universities like MIT, whether they're international organizations like CSIRO or even NIH in the U.S., they all have the same set of issues. They
Yeah.
all, when I was working with MIT, the people who I was working with said to me, we have hundreds of venture capitalists running all over this campus trying to do deals. And they're not able to do anywhere near the number of deals they want because they can't find those value propositions that have matured to the point where they're powerful and they can justify internally investing the money into it. So, that process of NABC or whatever form of that works in your organization,
Yeah.
that to me that's very important. That's worth my time trying to convey that message to people and help them practice it.
That's great. It's good to know that you're there still wanting to bring something back and help other people, like continue the world of innovation and make sure that the world continues to have exciting new technologies brought to life.
Yeah, I will add, by the way, that the World Economic Forum meets regularly, and as part of each of their meetings, they produce something called the Jobs Report. And one of the elements of the Jobs Report is they rank order the top 5 or 10 most important skill sets for the upcoming 3 years or 5 year period of time. And the last couple of times they've done that Jobs Report, the top skill set that they have identified uh, is innovation and complex problem solving.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's when you think about employment and unemployment and skills that will get at least some people caught up with where the economy is if they've fallen behind it. I think that learning innovation, at least basically, is important, and you don't have to do it with a Silicon Valley startup. Anybody can bring innovation into whatever they're doing. I don't care if you're an accounting clerk or you're a military officer. You can figure out how to add value, how to spot the really important problems to your organization, to your boss, to your coworkers, and then put together powerful solutions for it. It's a way of thinking.
Yes, and I think that's the most powerful takeaway that I've got from speaking to you today, is that it can be, and it is a skill that you can learn. It's not just something that's, out there and only very few people can do it. If you can learn the tools, if you can learn the concepts, you too can, add value to your life and the people around you.
Yep.
It's been great talking to you today. So thanks for everything, and hopefully we'll be able to speak to you again soon.
Great, Bob. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Okay, so this is the nice relaxed part of the podcast where we get to speak to our guest about the first date questions. That's if you went on a first date with a techie nerd, the sort of questions that he'd ask to get to know you a little bit better. The first question that I'd like to ask you, Tom, is what was your first computer?
So my first computer was the original IBM PC, which came out in the early 1980s. Apple and IBM were the first. Apple came out with a machine that was in low production quantity, and IBM quickly saw the potential, and they opened up a new division to produce the original IBM PCs. I think they had their manufacturing down in Palm Beach, Florida. And I was working for a large corporation at the time, and they were willing to help employees purchase their first PC.
Right.
But there was an old adage: you can't go wrong as a corporation employee buying an IBM. So they made an institutional decision that they would give you an interest-free loan to buy a computer, but it needed to be an IBM. It wasn't going to be an Apple. So I bought the first PC, and I learned to use it, but it was a struggle. I hated the fact that there were so many manuals and it was so non-intuitive. So as quickly as I could in 1984, I purchased my first Mac. And I still have that Mac. I have all the software and cabling that goes with it, and it's sitting in my garage and carefully packed away, and I'll bet if I plugged it in, I could power it up. So
sounds like me and my first computer. I've still got my Spectrum 48K. I still power that up every few years and play a few old games, because that's the interesting thing with something like the PC. It seems so powerful, and you sold that dream, and obviously your company was sold that dream, but when you actually first get it, you're like, I can't actually do anything with it.
Yeah, well, I got into flight simulators very heavily at that point in time. I will say it was obvious it was a productivity tool, but you really needed to figure out how to apply it to get the value out of it at that point. It's much more intuitive today.
Okay, the next question is, what is your favorite piece of software or application at the moment? I'm
going to give you a generic answer to that question, and I hope it's helpful and satisfying to some people. One of the people I got to know at SRI was a fellow named Doug Engelbart, and Doug was the original patent holder, along with SRI, of the mouse. He was the one who gave the demo. I think I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the mother of all demos, hypertext graphical user interface. In 1962, Doug had written a paper for the U.S. government on how to use the computer to augment human capability. And that was at a time when all computers did was run payroll, and there were big machines that sat in the lobby with a lot of lights that flashed. And his thing was using it to augment human capability. And if I think across the decades that I've had with the computer, with a personal computer, there have been just different phases. I mean, as a finance guy, I was always doing spreadsheets, right? And when you do a spreadsheet and you're developing a budget, the numbers on all the spreadsheets, the typed spreadsheets, are constantly changing. My secretary, my admin assistant, once we were halfway through the budget cycle, would take one of my budget original pages and hold it up to the light, and it was just pockmarked with all this whiteout that had been put over the numbers that I had changed over time. And the sheet was almost brittle. And the fact that the original VisiCalc, which preceded Excel, you could just go in and change numbers. The fact that you could the way I create text is I will get a rough version of it down, and then I'll forever be taking passes through it and playing with the words and editing it. And the fact that you could do that without having to start from scratch. So right at the very beginning, I would have said, wow, this is an amazing piece of productivity. And I could take that same thing up through the generations. And anytime there was a piece of software that allowed me to do something faster, better, uh, uh, more quickly, and allowed me to collaborate with other people, you know, the, I don't know if you went to business school, but one of the tools they use in business school are the Harvard case studies. And
I went to basically the Harvard of the UK, Aston University. I don't think most people class it as the Harvard of the UK, but they'll be glad that I said that.
so many times, I'd get a case study that had been Xeroxed by my boss where they'd list 15 different names and they put, this sounds good to me, what do you think? And they'd send Xerox copies of that out, and over the course of a couple of weeks, they'd get some sort of a response. The fact that these days you can take the equivalent of that and you can communicate it instantaneously to a group of people, you can get feedback instantaneously, and you can begin to collaborate on doing something with that. So it's the communications aspect of it. The computer itself evolved, the whole client server thing that came along, which allowed you to do things standalone and then interact with something more powerful to get bigger needs calculated, and then allowed you to interact with other people. So to me, what efficiency meant has evolved over time. But if it kept moving the ball forward in terms of my productivity, I was all for it. And I don't think that's stopped. I mean, there are tools today that could evaluate threat assessments. I mean, I've seen, if you think about the human cell and you think about the progress that we're making, I happen to serve on a board of a medical research institute that Jennifer Doudna serves on. She's the woman who just won the Nobel for inventing the CRISPR, it's gene editing technology. And if you look at all the software tools that surround the modeling and science, life science at that level, and how far that's come, and what that enables people in her field to do. We don't have to do everything through wet chemistry and wet biology anymore. We can simulate the outcome of certain things, and we can, whether it's testing a new drug, we can figure out how, 500 diseases will react to this one drug overnight. So I think it's that productivity, and I think we're on a multi-decade path, and it's still moving, and I think that's exciting.
Definitely, and accelerating. Next question would be, what was your best tech purchase for the last 12 months?
So I'll give you two answers. One of them is I love my flat screen television, and I bought a Pioneer Plasma about 20 years ago when flat screens first came out, and that one failed one day because a hole burned in the center of it that just got bigger and bigger, and then I had to take that 50-inch and replace it with a 65-inch Sony LCD. And I had that one for about a decade, and then that one fails in a different way. You start to get lines across it, and parts of it start to go dark. And I went out about 6 months ago shopping for a new screen, and I wound up with a 77-inch LG OLED. And that's the one all the write-ups of, the one that I have is not curved, but it's actually sitting right there on the wall behind me. But it's wonderful. I mean, the resolution is off the chart, and so I figure the next television is going to be a holodeck.
Probably, yeah.
My favorite purchase this year was that. I will say that another one that made the list was a gift that I got at Christmas, and that's the little Apple tags. That I can't see myself making another trip without putting one of those in each of my suitcases. just to make sure I know where it is. I wish they would come out with one that's small enough to attach to my eyeglasses and things that I'm losing all the time. But I think, good for Apple. I think they've come out with another winner there.
So with those tags, can you see that it's like just about to come onto the conveyor belt when you land?
I haven't actually tried to use it yet outside of my house.
Right.
So, the fact that I can sync it up and on my iPhone detect where it is, and it's the fact that Apple can tap into that global worldwide Bluetooth network, and use that to deliver a useful service to me without intruding on anybody's individual privacy as to the location data. I think that's a useful way to think about things. So very helpful.
Definitely. So the opposite of that, in Concise Conversations, we have Room 202, which is nothing to do with Room 101, but Room 202. So what item of technology would you put into Room 202? You'd get rid of it. You don't think it deserves to exist.
Wow. I've never... I have replaced a lot of things because there was something better out there. The only thing that I'm going to give you another generic answer, and I'm going to tell you that anything that is not intuitive,
Right.
There are some people whose mind is focused on reading thick manuals and working their way through, 75-page user manuals, and that's not me. There was a commercial 20 years ago where a kid is sitting with his father who's trying to hook up their new computer, and he's clearly been at it for a while and he's not being successful. And the kid finally puts on his jacket and he's walking out the door and he says, "I'm on my way over to Steve's house. They've got a Mac." And so to me, if it's intuitive and useful, I'm with it. If it's not, I guess that would be my candidate for the Room 101.
Yeah. A lot of stuff gets thrown straight in there. Can't use it. It's in. And then finally, I've got to ask you. You've already told me that you don't really use keyboard shortcuts, and I thought about that, and it's like, of course not. One of the developers of Siri is not going to be using keyboard shortcuts. It's going to all be voice activated. But are there any? Is that why you've not got a favorite keyboard shortcut? Because you've not used one since voice recognition came in?
It's interesting. I will tell you that in the development of Siri, two decisions were not made at the time we started Siri. One of them is it was not clear that it was going to be aimed mainly at mobile devices as opposed to your computer on your desktop, because Siri could work on your desktop just as well as it could work at a mobile device. The second decision that wasn't made initially was that it was going to be voice activated, because you could literally interface with Siri with a keyboard. So the decision to go with voice activated and on a on a mobile device was made late in the game, and but observe today that this computer, which is a desktop laptop, has got Siri on it, and I use that sometimes, but sometimes I'm still using the keyboard. So
brilliant. Thanks a lot, Tom. That's been great getting to know you a little bit better.
Bob, this is terrific, and I applaud it. I've looked at some of the other episodes, and I look forward to tracking them in the future.
Brilliant.
I've enjoyed it too.